We talked about the good part. By the way, this is just very, very clear in the book, so of course I know what the answer is. Which section of the game do you think is pretty close to a travesty?
Yeah, so first off, I'll note that my book is not a teardown of the game. I love playing this game, and yeah, it has historical problems, but I don't spend the entirety of the book, gouging the game for what it gets wrong. I'd look at the game quite sympathetically in many ways, but sometimes as a historian, I do have to be like, okay, well, come on now. To me, the thing that's like really sticks out in your face most with it regarding the sort of, distortion of the past has to do with the levels of violence. I saw one video game website actually counted up like the number of people that Arthur Morgan would kill under an honorable playthrough, like the minimum number. It was 900, right? So that's a tremendously tall pile of bodies. In reality, there were only a handful of outlaws who even killed 10 people, right? So 900 is so bizarrely out of whack, to be clear. And I mean, the game does nail the question that, the United States, or at least certain portions of it, were violent, unusually violent at that moment. But one of the other big things that the game misses out on is what caused that violence. Because in the game, most of the violence that takes place on the screen is usually personal or random. Like it's motivated by grudges. It's motivated by the individual pursuit of wealth, right? Through robberies and holdups and that sort of thing. Whiskey, overabundance of whiskey. Those are the kinds of things that usually kind of trigger violence in the game. And that's not unlike most Westerns that have been made in the last 60, 70 years. But one of the big things I try to prove in my book and illustrate is that when bullets flew in the West or the South or in Appalachia of the 1880s, 1890s, usually it was tied up with big social and political problems. It had to do with things like capitalism. It had to do with things like race and inequalities of race. The game gestures to this once in a while. You got this robber baron, Leviticus Cornwall, kind of bringing corporate capitalism to the West and South. But it's usually at the sidelines, right? The kind of social and political questions are not at center stage. And that's another big critique I have of the game, is that there's two institutions that are almost entirely absent from the game, but would have dominated people's lives at the time. One of them is party politics. Right? Like, no one has political identity in Red Dead 2. In fact, Arthur Morgan even says, I think politics is stupid. Who would ever want to vote? That's a dumb idea. There are no Republicans and no Democrats. And of course, I understand that Rockstar wants to be careful and, avoid a live wire contemporary political debates. But you have to understand that in the 1890s, politics was so dominant in people's lives. The voter turnout at that time was significantly higher than it is today. And of course, we live in a very politically charged moment ourselves. So like trying to imagine the 1890s without like partisan affiliations is like trying to understand America today without, the divisions that we know all too well around us. So that's one kind of like pink elephant in the room that the game totally misses out on. And then the other pink elephant is the labor movement, the quest of workers to unionize and get better wages and working conditions and all that. This is a movement that's really coming to a crescendo in the late 1800s, something that had only kind of been a towering issue since about the Civil War or so, but was the political question of the day. Like everyone had a strong viewpoint. It was hard to sit in the middle on debates about labor and corporate capitalism. And the game only very briefly touches upon this. I think there's this one, as I've counted, one single reference to labor unions in the game right near the death of Leviticus Cornwall toward the end of the game. But it's like 3 seconds, to go 100 hours and hear about the labor movement 3 seconds is kind of hilarious. But again, I think I understand why Rockstar might have avoided it. They're also a big company themselves who probably has their own labor issues that they're working through. So if they make this an aggressively pro-union game, well, I don't know, that's opening a can of worms.